World History of Christianity, Chapter 9, Part 1, Latin America, Adrian Hastings, 16th century Spain. The Christianity of South America was, primarily, a precise transportation of the Catholicism of the Iberian Peninsula in the age of the Catholic kings Isabella and Ferdinand, Charles V, Philip II. The American conquests became an adjunct of the crown of Castile, and it is in Castile that an intelligible history of the Latin American Church must begin. When Columbus discovered America in 1492, believing it, however, to be just the eastern side of Asia, Spain was entering upon the age of its greatest power, and the decisive construction of its image as the standard-bearer of Catholicism. The relatively tolerant convivencia of Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, which had been a striking characteristic of early medieval Spain, was brought to an end. That very year the Jews were expelled from Spain, and Granada, the last Iberian Muslim kingdom, was conquered and annexed to Castile. The enforced conversion of the Mudejanes began. The identity of Castile, as also of Portugal, had to a quite considerable extent been forged by the long crusading wars which had little by little re-established Christian rule throughout the peninsula. The spirit of crusade, intolerant, aggressive, insistent upon a uniform political religious orthodoxy, triumphed above all else under Isabella. It was her establishment of the Inquisition in Castile in the 1480s, soon extended by Ferdinand to Aragon, which ensured for more than 2 centuries the stability of her particular form of highly state-controlled Catholicism. Its initial purpose was to pursue secret Jews or Judaizers among the numerous conversos, Christians of Jewish blood, but its efficiency and ruthless probing of evidence for unorthodoxy of any kind ensured that Protestantism never made any advance south of the Pyrenees, and that religious writers of any tendency could quickly come under suspicion. The Spain of the 16th century remained, in consequence, it could be said, a very medieval society, rather little affected by the great movements of thought from the Renaissance on, even though parts of Italy and the Low Countries were included within the realms of Charles V and Philip II. But medieval is, in some ways, a misnomer. Medieval Spain quite lacked the systematic intolerance of 16th century Spain. Moreover, the Church of the latter and its Inquisition was entirely controlled by the monarchy. The exclusion of papal power was almost absolute. It was, however, in many ways a far more religiously intense society than the Spain of earlier centuries. Under the leadership of the highly intelligent and ascetic Franciscan Cardinal Ximenes de Cisneros, Archbishop of the Primatial See of Toledo, who had earlier been Isabella's confessor, the religious orders were reformed and scholarship encouraged, not least in the University of Alcalá, which he himself founded. Perhaps more surprising, the first polyglot Bible of modern times, with parallel texts in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin, was produced on his commissioning. Spain was by far the most powerful state in 16th century Europe. If its power was used both for the extension of the greatest empire the world had seen since the fall of Rome, and for the advancement of Catholic Christianity, it was linked with a remarkable revival of theology and philosophy, especially Thomist in the University of Salamanca and elsewhere. The development by the Dominican theologian Francisco de Victoria of a theory of international law based on the Thomist concept of natural law has remained lastingly important, while the great spiritual writers of the century, notably John of the Cross, Teresa of Avila, and Ignatius Loyola demonstrate the intense quality of its religious life. 16th century Spain had an army of missionaries, Dominican, Franciscan, and later Jesuit, at its disposal, unrivaled in any other part of Europe. It had then the religious as well as the military resources to respond with enormous vigor to the chance discovery of a new hemisphere by an Italian adventurer, moved, it seems, largely by a millennial belief that the history of the world was soon to end, and that his transatlantic voyage was part of a providential scheme for beginning its final age. The extraordinary extent near universal, universal, universality of the realms of Charles V and Philip II encouraged a powerful sense that they and their empire were favored by Providence in a unique way, and part of that favor was that on them had been bestowed dominion over America, its wealth, and its millions of people. On them their conversion to Christianity depended, as Pope Alexander VI, a Spaniard and a rogue if ever there was one on the papal throne, had made clear when in 1493 he granted to the kings of Spain and Portugal both sovereignty and the patronato, total responsibility for evangelization of all the new lands their subjects were uncovering. The first 150 years of Latin American Catholicism. In 1493, neither the Catholic kings nor the Pope had any clear idea of the vastness or character of the societies west of the Atlantic their expeditions had only just begun to explore and conquer. At that point, it was the Antilles, the islands of the Caribbean, they had in their sight. Hispaniola, with its capital of Santo Domingo, constituted the core of this new empire for the first decade, and a diocese of Santo Domingo was established in 1504. Then, in 1515, came the conquest of Cuba and the establishment of a new center of imperialist advance at Havana. Only in 1519 was the mainland attacked, with Cortez's conquest of Mexico, which became henceforth New Spain. From there, bands of conquistadors fanned out in every direction until Pizarro invaded Peru in 1532. Within another few years, the Spanish Empire of the New World was virtually complete. One America was in ruins, a new one imposed. That now devastated First America had developed over many centuries, a world until 1492 totally apart from the Afro-Asian European complex of humanity, since many thousands of years earlier, the ancestors of American Indians had, it is presumed, crossed the straits from Asia to Alaska. By 1492, the American Indian world consisted socially of three very different groups. There were the two highly centralized states organized by the Mexicas, Aztecs in Mexico around their capital, Tenochtitlan, and by the Incas in Tawantinsuyu, Peru, around their capital, Cuzco. These two extraordinarily interesting kingdoms had existed for only a few centuries or less and were still rapidly developing at the time of the Spanish invasion, but they drew upon earlier civilizations, both Mesoamerican and Andean, of which the Mayan, extending in Central America through Guatemala, Yucatan, and central Mexico, was the most important. This, too, had been in part an urban society. It and many others continued politically fragmented within and around the Aztec and Inca kingdoms. Beyond these were a much more geographically extensive range of peoples, far less politically or technically advanced. They included the population of the Caribbean and most of the peoples of South America, broken up into hundreds of language groups and seemingly devoid of any type of statehood. They were hunters, gatherers, and fishers. Their European observers commented upon their innocence, gentleness, and docility, and later upon their uselessness as laborers in mine or plantation. Undoubtedly, it was the Aztecs and the Incas who fascinated and horrified the incoming Spaniards. They possessed wealth in gold and silver, towns of amazing splendor filled with palaces and temples, and a highly organized social system, at once religious, agricultural, and military. Their languages, the Nahuatl of the Aztecs and the Quechua of the Incans, were administrative media, lingua francas, imposed for public use on many other tongues, and Nahuatl, as well as Maya, had developed a written form. Religion included many gods, some of them the tutelary deities of peoples now absorbed into a single empire. At Tenochtitlan, these were kept in a special temple, the common house of the gods. Among the most important Mexican deities was Tonantzin, Tonantzin, a great mother goddess, but the dominant worship both of the Aztecs and the Incas was that of the sun. They were the people of the sun, and among each the sun had to be placated by continuous human sacrifice. A primary purpose of war, especially in Mexico, was to obtain new victims for the sacrificial rites to the sun. Huitzilopochtli, which were central to the life of society. Linked with sun worship went an intense preoccupation with the calendar, characteristic already of earlier Maya civilizations. The precision of their calendars, based on the work of priests in the royal observatories, and the span of years they incorporate, remain one of the most striking aspects of this whole group of societies. Both Aztec and Inca empires were highly ordered worlds, with moral laws strictly enforced, no alcoholism, common property, and systems of collective organization and ritual behavior, which both amazed and horrified their highly individualistic invaders. The Spanish impact proved incredibly disastrous, as was already clear in the first 20 years before the mainland was assaulted. The Papal Bull of 1493 established the character of the invasion as one of evangelization. It was that which justified it. In royal eyes, this was never merely a specious excuse. On the contrary, it was taken extremely seriously, at times agonizingly so. The motivation and behavior of the conquistadors themselves was something very different. Here was a gang of adventurers, mostly men quite insignificant at home, risking their lives in pursuit of gold. Yet there was precious little gold to be found in the Antilles. The growing population of settlers needed native labor if they were going to achieve anything at all, and though Isabella had forbidden the enslavement of her pagan subjects, the Indians were conscripted into one or another encomienda granted to a conquistador, whereby they were compelled to work for him in the mines or the fields, while the women were seized as concubines. Far from becoming an efficient labor force, however, they simply faded away under the impact of brutal treatment, extreme social disorientation, and a wave of European imported illnesses. When Columbus first arrived, Hispaniola was claimed to be a well-populated island. There was soon next to no native left there or anywhere else in the Caribbean. Seldom has genocide, actually in no way intended, been so rapid or so complete. On the Sunday before Christmas 1511, Antonio de Montesinos, one of the first Dominican party who had arrived in Hispaniola the year before, denounced the settlers from the pulpit of the Cathedral of Santo Domingo for their ill treatment of the Indians. Are they not men? You are all in a state of mortal sin because of the cruelty and the tyranny you are inflicting on these innocent victims. It was the beginning of a long campaign which infuriated the conquistadors, the governor included, but which the Spanish government, with its devout commitment to evangelization, could not ignore. Yet effectively there was little it could do. The whole enterprise had developed an irreversible momentum, which required native labor as much as it destroyed it. The very collapse of the aboriginal population in every place that was occupied forced the conquistadors to advance into new territories in pursuit of labor as much as gold, while beginning the importation of black slaves from Africa to replace the natives they were wiping out. In 1519, the focus of the process was transferred from the islands to the mainland, where a great deal more gold could be found. Pedrerius de Villa, one of the most brutal of all the conquistadors, founded the city of Panama, while Hernan Cortes invaded Mexico from Cuba. A few hundred men overthrew a magnificent civilization after marveling at the splendor of Tenochtitlan. How could it happen? It was not so much a matter of a handful of muskets and 16 horses. The Aztecs were psychologically far more unprepared than the Spaniards for this strange encounter. Montezuma, their king, actually welcomed Cortes as the legendary figure of Quetzalcoatl, returned from the east to reclaim the land. Montezuma was seized, the Aztec nobility massacred, and though for a few months the Spaniards were forced to abandon Tenochtitlan, they recaptured it in ruins in August 1521. By then, the Aztecs had been ravaged not only by fighting, but still more by smallpox. Moreover, in Mexico, as later in Peru, the war was not really one between a huge Indian army and a tiny Spanish one, because the Spaniards had persuaded many people unwillingly subject to the Aztecs to rise in revolt against them. The very centralization of both Aztec and Inca realms contributed to their quick collapse. The decentralized Maya, or the Araucanian Indians in southern Chile, proved more effectively resistant, but where there was less evidence of gold or silver, the conquering impulse was less sustained. As the military advance continued, followed by the forcing of Indians into the shackles of the encomienda system, two decisive developments resulted. On the one hand was the collapse of the indigenous population. On the other, the growth of a network of Spanish towns inhabited by the middle of the 16th century by a largely Creole population. That is to say, people of Spanish blood, but born in America, supplemented by a mestizo population of mixed blood. Almost everywhere, the Indian population rapidly and steadily declined. Disagreement over probable figures remains considerable. Nevertheless, it seems most likely that the Indian population of Spanish-ruled America by the late 16th century was less than a quarter of what it had been 100 years earlier, and it continued to be reduced by the enforced labor, which became all the worse as total numbers declined. There were major plagues, as in 1575 through 77, and a general disintegration of society and its moral norms, reflected most obviously in the spread of alcoholism. Meanwhile, a new institutional and ecclesiastical world had come into existence, entirely dependent upon the authority of the Crown of Castile and the Council of the Indies in Madrid, but controlled locally by the two viceroys of New Spain and Peru. Beneath them were various provincial governors and the 9 audiencias based in Santo Domingo, Mexico City, Panama, Quito, Lima, and elsewhere. But beneath them, too, by the early 17th century, were 5 archbishops, 27 bishops, 2 universities, over 400 priories, and colleges of religious orders, not to speak of countless parishes. By 1620, there were 36 bishoprics in Spanish America, and no further one was created until near the end of the 18th century. What did continue to grow was the number of university, or in many cases, effectively seminaries, opened by the religious orders or the episcopate to cope with the training of the growing number of Creole priests. But what needs here to be made clear is that the church's organization, quite as much as that of the colonial state, depended wholly and solely upon Madrid. At no point did Rome enter into any appointment. Even more than the Church of Spain itself, this was a Catholic church from which, organizationally though not doctrinally, the papacy was wholly excluded. The paradoxical character of the Patronato was that it both excluded papal intervention and established royal authority over the church in strictly papalist terms. Moreover, the system by no means excluded acceptance of new developments elsewhere in the Catholic Church, especially in regard to the Council of Trent, to which the Spanish contribution had in fact been very considerable. The Latin American Church became, ideologically, emphatically, Tridentine. Yet in administrative terms, there was but one exception to the totality of royal control. That exception was the Society of Jesus. The Jesuits, as we shall see, became immensely powerful in Latin America, but here, as everywhere, they remained faithful to the central principle of their society, which was one of absolute obedience to the general resident in Rome, who was himself obedient to the Pope. In New Spain, as in Old Spain, the Jesuits maintained their basic freedom at once from royal control, from episcopal supervision, and from the jurisdiction of the Inquisition, this despite a good deal of pressure from Philip II upon the papacy. Vast indeed must the growth of the Church have appeared in the century and a half following Columbus's first expedition. How providential it all could appear. Even the fact that Cortez invaded Mexico in 1519, just when Martin Luther was disrupting the church in Europe, could be and was interpreted as a supreme expression of providence. God had called the New World into existence to put right the mishaps of the old. Certainly Philip II could never have carried on his European wars without the support of the American treasure fleet. If God held back any knowledge of this vast world from Christians until now, and then bestowed it entirely upon the Catholic kings, this demonstrated almost incontrovertibly the entirely special role that Spain was called upon to play in sacred and human history. The development of the history of Christianity in Latin America was shaped in consequence not just by Catholicism, of a mixed medieval and counter-Reformation sort, not just by its being part of a large colonial empire, but by a very special sort of sacred imperialism, a conviction on the hand of providence, of manifest destiny, which is foundational to the thinking of almost everyone upon the Spanish side, which would not begin to be shattered until eventually the Spanish Empire itself was shattered, not only politically, but intellectually by the emergence instead at the heart of the Western world, of power systems inherently opposed to it. When the various orders of friars, most notably Franciscans and Dominicans, began work in the Americas, it was to convert to Christianity the Indian societies which inhabited them. It is striking that the Catholic kings saw no point in dispatching across the Atlantic any of the more contemplative orders. No primarily monastic tradition took root in Spanish America. The friars came above all as missionaries, if with a somewhat simplistic conception of what missionary work must entail. In Mexico, at least, where the first 12 Franciscans arrived in 1524, they believed they had found very willing converts. Brutal as Cortez had been in conquest, he, more than any of the conquistadors, was anxious that society should continue to function in a stable way, even if the people were to be compulsorily resettled in villages, each laid out around a church and a prison. It was the religious orders who could supervise his new societies, and that was what the Franciscans of the strict observance, bristling with the devout enthusiasm that Cardinal Cisneros had inculcated, were anxious to do. Here already a model of separation between Indian, and Spaniard informed the missionary plan. What is more remarkable is the enthusiasm Mexicans at first showed for their new faith. The unity of belief and government in Aztec Mexico had been so absolute that the one collapsed with the other, and if the King of Spain had replaced Montezuma, then Catholicism must replace the religion of the sun. Baptisms took place by the thousand. Mexicans participated in the liturgy with vast enthusiasm, begging to be allowed to build churches, and flogged one another remorselessly in the penitential processions of Good Friday. They were quick to learn Spanish, and many of the crafts and arts the missionaries taught them, while the latter studied Nahuatl and other Indian languages. Cortes rounded up over 1,000 children of the Indian nobility and handed them over to the Franciscans for special education, which would, he hoped, lead many of them to the priesthood. The first Archbishop of Mexico, Juan de Zumarraga, himself a Franciscan, composed the first catechism, as well as overseeing the destruction of hundreds of pagan temples and tens of thousands of idols. But the man who best expressed the excitement of these early years of Mexican Christianity was Toribio de Benavente, one of the first 12 Franciscans to arrive, who is better known by his Nahuatl name of Motolinia, the Poor One. He and his brethren stressed the diabolical character of Aztec rule, as shown by the unceasing round of human sacrifice and cannibalism, but this provided the backdrop for their interpretation of what had happened as the passing of a new Israel from the idolatry of Egypt into the promised land of the Church. At the same time, they studied Indian history, were fascinated particularly by the Mexican calendar, and became fluent in Nahuatl. When Motolinia recognized how cruelly the Indians were treated by the Spaniards, and that they had greatly declined in numbers, the central theme of his Historia de los Indios de la Nueva España, 1541, was one of deliverance from darkness into a near millennial light. If the conquistadors had made it possible for all these peoples to become Christian and subjects of the King of Spain, they should not be too harshly judged. The Franciscans were optimists. Bishop Zumarraga's College of Santa Cruz at Tlatelolco was intended to produce an Indian clergy who were taught Latin theology and philosophy, but none was ever ordained, as it became clear how unsuitable celibacy was for Indians. The college continued, nevertheless, for many years, educating men who became assistants of the friars in the creation of a Nahuatl Christian literature. The greatest Franciscan scholar of Nahuatl, Bernardino de Sahagún, taught there, and his disciples helped him in his researches into Indian culture. A graduate of Salamanca, Sahagún little by little constructed an amazingly valuable account of Indian history and culture, almost an encyclopedia. The Historia General de las Cosas de Nueva España was actually written first in Nahuatl, but the Spanish version being a translation. It was completed in the 1570s, but tragically never printed until the 19th century. Coming a generation later than Motolinia, and entering into Indian realities with exceptional sympathy, Sahagún was deeply pessimistic about the whole missionary and colonial enterprise. The Indian population had vastly declined, and as the Creole population grew, they became ever more marginal in their own land. Even the nobility, whose position was recognized in part by Cortes, lost its role of leadership as Indian land was alienated and the population relocated by force away from their own villages. It was clearer than ever that only the friars, in their paternalistic way, remained to protect Indian society from becoming no more than an underclass of serfs. In Peru, the picture had always been more somber. There, no early wave of Indian Christian enthusiasm had ever been reported, and, on the contrary, it was claimed that Indians were so far from having become genuinely Christians at all that the Council of Lima in 1552 forbade their admission to communion. The reason for this may well have lain in the survival for some decades of an independent Inca state. Pizarro murdered the Inca Atahualpa and captured Cuzco in 1533, but at first made use of Atahualpa's half-brothers, Manco Inca and Palu, as intermediaries between the Indian and Spanish power. In this, he seemed to be imitating Cortes in Mexico, but the fact that he located the Spanish capital of Peru on the coast of Lima allowed the Inca symbolic tradition to survive at Cuzco in a way that was not possible in Mexico, where Tenochtitlan at once disappeared beneath Mexico City. Moreover, Manco soon rose in rebellion, and while failing to recapture Cuzco, established a neo-Inca state in the mountains of Vilcabamba, which included the sacred sanctuary of Machu Picchu. The Spaniards, Manco declared, had proved themselves by their deeds to be not sons of God, but of the devil. While one of Manco's sons, Sari Tupac, later surrendered to the Spaniards and was rewarded with a rich estate, another, Titu Cusi, continued the resistance. In consequence, there was no political reason for the people of Peru to abandon their gods wholesale, as had happened in Mexico. It was only in 1572 that a ruthlessly determined new viceroy, Francisco de Toledo, overthrew the state of Vilcabamba and ordered the beheading of its captured Inca, Tupac Amaru, in the public square of Cuzco in the presence of an appalled multitude, and despite the protests of the ecclesiastical authorities. There is a fine early 17th century painting by an unknown Cuzquino artist depicting the marriage of Martin Garcia de Loyola, the nephew of St. Ignatius Loyola, with Beatriz Nusta, the daughter of Sari Tupac. Yet Loyola was the commander of the expedition which had defeated and seized Tupac Amaru, his wife's uncle. 20 years later, in 1598, Loyola himself was captured by the Araucanian Indians and his head paraded on an Indian spear. Few Spanish-Indian unions had been celebrated with the solemnity of Loyola's. For the most part, they were cohabitations rather than marriages, and their offspring were in consequence canonically excluded from ordination to the priesthood. In the hope of developing an Indian priesthood and one at home in Indian languages, Gregory IX explicitly permitted the ordination of mestizos and illegitimate sons in 1576, but this hardly began to happen on any considerable scale for another 200 years. To Don Martin de Loyola and the Princess Beatrice, we might add 5 other figures to represent the Catholicism of Peru as it was developing towards and beyond the close of the 16th century. The first was a Dominican, Domingo de Santo Tomas, who had arrived there in 1540. A theologian and linguist, he published the first grammar of the Quechua language, 1560, and became an ardent campaigner for the civic rights of the Indians, returning to Spain for 6 years as their delegate to argue their case. The second, Toribio de Mogrovejo, was appointed Archbishop of Lima by Philip II in 1580. He had previously worked in the Inquisition in Granada. A man of enormous energy, between 1580 and his death in 1606, he carried out a systematic reorganization of the Peruvian Church, including holding the first 10 Lima diocesan synods and 3 Peruvian provincial councils. His Catechismo Mayor was published at Lima in 1584 in Spanish, Quechua, and Aymara. Here was the very model of a Tridentine bishop, firm both in his pastoral strategy and even in standing up to the political authorities when he judged it necessary. It was a strategy which increasingly insisted on the extirpation of idols. Our third figure is St. Rose of Lima, 1586 through 1617, the first canonized saint of the New World. She was a Creole, her parents Spanish settlers who had speculated in the mines, but unsuccessfully. She joined the Third Order of St. Dominic, lived in a hut in the garden, and practiced the most severe physical penance. There is nothing about her that seems specifically American. She represents the export of a certain type of Iberian spirituality. The fact that she existed and was canonized testifies to the way a Creole church was stabilizing itself, beside and above the Indian church. Our fourth choice is another saint, Martin de Porres, 1579 through 1639. He too lived in Lima, the exact contemporary of St. Rose. While she was canonized in 1671, being white, he had to wait until 1962, being black. His father admittedly was a Spaniard, but his mother was a Negro and he was illegitimate. The rules of the Peruvian Dominican province did not permit them to accept blacks or mulattoes even as lay brothers, but Martin was allowed to be a voluntary servant, wear a religious habit, and look after the infirmary attached to the priory of Our Lady of the Rosary. He became the very model of a medieval saint. His boundless charity brought crowds of Indians and blacks to seek help. He spent his nights in prayer and penance. Even animals did as he told them. Even Dominicans did, coming for spiritual direction to one who humbly described himself as mulatto dog. The Viceroy of Peru attended the funerals of both Rose and Martin, and the popular cult of both was enduring, but it remains striking that the institutional church canonized the one so fast and held back on the other so long. Our final figure is by far the least predictable. Sometime around 1614, an extraordinary document consisting of 1,190 folio pages and 496 illustrations was sent from Lima to Spain, where it disappeared, to be discovered in the Royal Library in Copenhagen in 1895. Its author, Guaman Poma de Ayala, was a very elderly Indian, a scion of the provincial nobility, who knew Spanish of a sort, but interlarded it with Quechua, and even the odd phrase of Aymara. His enormous testament was written as a protest to the Viceroy at the vast injustices in Spanish rule, but included a whole history of Peru and its customs, inserted within a biblical chronology. Guaman Poma's account of traditional Peru was of a thoroughly moral society. How the Indians of old were Christian, although they were pagans. They observed God's commandments and the good works of compassion. Today, in contrast, the poor of Jesus Christ are persecuted by priests and rulers of every sort. At times it is a matter for tears, and at times for laughter, and at times for pity. In Peru, he concluded, there is no God or king. They are in Rome and Castile. This extraordinary book, the discovered yet highly detailed outpourings of an old man, otherwise totally unknown, the work itself saved for us today by sheer chance, must all the same represent the sort of Christian vision which numerous other Indians had acquired by the early 17th century. It included an absolute refusal to blacken the Indian past in the way almost all Spaniards endeavored to do, but it fused that past with the major elements of biblical history and Christian belief, as mediated through the pastoral ministry of a church led by men like Archbishop de Mogrovejo. Yet the voice of Guaman Poma is not only that of people of his own generation, but one may judge countless voiceless Indian Christians across the next 3 centuries too. Guaman Poma praised Jesuits and Franciscans, but spoke harshly of Dominicans, Augustinians, and Mercedarians for their pride and ill treatment of Indians. In other circumstances, the praise and blame would be differently divided. What is clear is that there was no one clerical attitude to all the issues troubling the Spanish Empire. Many, probably most, priests were highly supportive of the imperial endeavor in almost all its ramifications. The critics, however, few as they may have been, have proved the more memorable, but no one comparably to Bartolome de las Casas. It is more than time that we turn to consider it is more than time that we turn to consider him and his work, controversial as they were, both in his own time and almost ever since. Las Casas remains the supreme figure of the religious history of Spanish America. Let us start with a succinct curriculum vitae. He was born in Seville in 1484. His father and uncle were in Columbus's second expedition, and he himself crossed the Atlantic at the age of 18 in 1502. In the following years he lived as a settler, but was ordained as a secular priest, the first priest to say his first mass in America. He joined in the expedition that conquered Cuba and obtained an encomienda there. The grant of a number of Indians compelled henceforth to give him labor service. He set them to work in the mines. In 1514, under Dominican influence, he broke with the system, freed his Indians, and returned to Spain the next year. He was then 31, and he would henceforth campaign unceasingly in defense of Indian rights until his death 51 years later. In 1524, he joined the Dominican order, and in 1543 rather unwillingly agreed to be the bishop of Chiapas, a poor diocese in the south of Mexico. It is important that one remembers how deep his own experience had been in his 12 years as a settler in Hispaniola and Cuba. He knew very well what he was talking about when he thundered against the crimes perpetrated in the name of Spain and Christianity. From his 1516 Memorial de Remedios, through his missionary treatise, Del único modo de atraer a todos los pueblos a la verdadera religión, written in Mexico about 1540, and his particularly vehement Brevísima Relación de la Destrucción de las Indias of 1542, to his massive Historia de las Indias and Apologia Historia Sumeria, composed in the 1550s. During his final years of struggle in Spain, Las Casas brought up a coherent yet steadily developing indictment of the entire colonial enterprise. Almost monotonously violent as his denunciations can seem, that reflects only too well the monotonous violence of the conquistadors as they devastated one society after another. Las Casas was not an effective missionary or church administrator, and his brief periods in those roles were not a success. They could not be. The situation on the ground was far too unfavorable, and he was someone unable to hold his tongue. Yet even in narrowly missionary terms, his critique of contemporary methods of conversion, particularly the mass baptisms by Franciscans in Mexico, is impressive. His role, however, was not that of a practitioner, but of a prophet, and it was exercised most forcefully in Spain, where he spent most of his later years. That was the right place to be, because only the crown could do something to control the colonizers. However, even the crown could do relatively little in a situation where news traveled slowly and royal decrees were hard to enforce against recalcitrant conquistadors on the ground, particularly when the crown remained dependent in the last resort on those same conquistadors to ensure its annual supply of gold and silver. While the new laws of 1542 intended to end the worst abuses by ordering the immediate emancipation of all Indian slaves and a vigorous reform of the encomienda system, were seen as due to the influence of Las Casas. They produced a highly hostile reaction throughout the Americas and open revolt in Peru. If then and later Las Casas did actually succeed in modifying both royal policy and to an extent the actual situation on the ground, it was due not only to his own fierce insistence and power of arguing, but also to the support he received from many other churchmen in America, as well as from Dominican theologians at the University of Salamanca. Francisco de Vitoria's famous lecture at Salamanca in 1539, Relectio de Indis, was an application of his Thomist philosophy to the problems of the Indies. He provided the academic grounding in terms both of an evaluation of Indian culture and of the principles of a just war for the more impassioned writings of Las Casas. Las Casas, whether he was conscious of it or not, was always faced with a dilemma. The more he challenged almost everything the Spanish had done in the New World, other than the preaching of Christianity, and the more he lauded the political and cultural intrusions of pre-Spanish America, the harder it was to justify the conquest or the authority of the Crown of Castile in any terms whatsoever. And yet, if he questioned the latter, his whole case must in practical terms fall to the ground. The only hope of reform was to strengthen not only the moral purpose, but also the power of the crown in regard to America. While Vittoria, more concerned with what was becoming a coherent philosophy of international law, simply denied the papal power to donate the undiscovered world to Spain or Portugal, Las Casas based his justification of Spanish royal authority precisely on the papal donation, but limited it in consequence to a sort of religious overlordship. There was absolutely no authority for armed invasion or for overthrowing Indian rulers who had every natural right to resist. The claim put forward by so many churchmen that the cruelty of Aztec religion with its multiple human sacrifice was so diabolical as to justify outside intervention cut no ice with Las Casas. On the contrary, he audaciously justified human sacrifice as a very natural expression of the duty of humankind to offer to God the highest gift available. It is clear that Las Casas knew a very great deal about the Americas, even parts he had never visited. His fellow Dominican, Domingo de Santo Tomas, was probably responsible for providing him with much of his detailed Peruvian information. His Historia de las Indias was written precisely to describe and defend Indian culture, Indian history, Indian worth, and above all, Indian rationality. Throughout these years, we see development within both his position and his arguments. This is hardly surprising, given the fact that he began not at all as an academic, but as a young lay colonial, drawn into the enterprise by his father, with little thought as to what it involved. Thus it is noteworthy that in the early stages of his campaign, Las Casas argued pragmatically in favor of the importation of black slaves to do the work and relieve the burden on the Indians, and he has often been condemned for saying so. What is less often pointed out is that the mature Las Casas profoundly rejected this proposal, denouncing the African slave trade with considerable vigor. He was, of course, in consequence, both of his uninhibited denunciation of colonial brutality and of his actual influence on royal policy, a very unpopular man, accused of maligning the conquistadors and blackening the good name of Spain. This continued after his death, due to the translation into other languages of his Brevissima Relation, which was published in Dutch in 1578 and then in French, English, German, and Latin, illustrated by numerous engravings of Spanish atrocities. It may well be said that the entire subsequent literary tradition of Latin America in regard to its 16th century construction has been formed around Las Casas. The appropriation of his central judgments upon the one hand, and attempted belittlement upon the other. He remains one of the supreme religious figures of the 16th century, and perhaps the most important missionary intellectual of the post-medieval period. Las Casas died in 1566. Tupac Amaru was executed in the central square of Cusco 6 years later. The church, which was being shaped in the next 50 years by men like Archbishop de Mogrovejo, in lands now firmly and irrevocably controlled by Spain, no longer thought of itself as just or even primarily a mission to Indian societies. It was a Spanish church glorying in the very Spanish holiness of a Rose of Lima, but it was still a church trying hard, especially through the work of the Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits, to maintain within it a Quechua, Aymara, or Nahuatl Christianity. In some ways, it succeeded in doing so, as one can surmise through a study of Guaman Poma's amazing pages. Despite the execution of Tupac Amaru, Cuzco and the mountains of Peru did retain a specifically Inca historical identity, an identity which coalesced with a newer Christian one. In the celebrations for the beatification of Ignatius Loyola in 1610, the figures of 11 Inca monarchs were carried in procession, and the walls of the Jesuit college in Cusco came to be adorned with their portraits.